And here's a particularly eloquent statement of this thesis by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Now, Richard Dawkins has been in the news lately, along with others of the so-called new atheists, or the four horsemen of atheism, not the four horsemen of the apocalypse, not even the four horsemen of Notre Dame, but the four horsemen of atheism. And one of these four horsemen is Dawkins. This book of his, The Blind Watchmaker, I think is a very good book. He's written a more recent book called The God Delusion, which I think is a very bad book, more like an ignorant screed than a real contribution to any particular discussion or discipline. But The Blind Watchmaker is a good book. And here's what he says. He says, early on in the book, he says, all appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. A true watchmaker has foresight. He designs his cogs and springs and plans their interconnections with a future purpose in his mind's eye. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and has no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. All right, that's the blind. Natural selection is the blind watchmaker. And the subtitle of this book is, now the very subtitle, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. All right? Now, why does Dawkins think that natural selection is blind and unguided? Why does he think that the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design? Well, in this book, he really does three things. First, he recounts some of the fascinating anatomical details of certain living creatures and of their behavior. So, for example, he talks about bats, and when he does this, he's very good. He's very good in explaining and exploring and describing the natural world. He talks about bats and how they can fly through a completely darkened cave, no light at all, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites rising from the floor, or maybe it's the other way around, but whatever. Can fly through at an enormous rate of speed and not so much as brush any of them. By virtue of they have a kind of sonar, right? The bats send out little squeaky sounds and receive these sounds, bounce off various objects that come back. By virtue of them, the bat can do this kind of navigation. Secondly, he tries to refute arguments for the idea that blind, unguided evolution could not have produced some of the wonders of the living world. So going all the way back to Darwin's time, there were people, St. George Mivart, for example, who said, well, there are certain things, certain kinds of features of animals, certain kinds of organs that just could not have come about by virtue of blind, unguided evolution. The eye was a kind of favorite example. Well, Dawkins does what he can to try to refute these arguments. And third, he makes suggestions as to how these, the ones like eyes and so on, and other organic systems could have developed by way of unguided evolution. All right? The form of his main argument, though, here's the form of the main argument, i.e., the argument for the conclusion that evolution reveals a universe without design. All right? Now, if I could, I'd write this down on a blackboard, but despite our being extremely high-tech, we don't have a blackboard. So pay very careful attention. Okay? The premise, then, is an argument that has a premise and a conclusion. The premise is we know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. All right? We know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all of life has come to be by way of unguided evolution. That's the premise. The conclusion is all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. As far as I can make out, that's the form of his main argument. I mean, that is the form of the argument for the conclusion that evolution reveals a universe without design. The argument really is it's possible, so it must have happened. Or nobody has proved it to be impossible, therefore it happened. Okay? Now, philosophers sometimes give uncogent arguments, and I must confess I've done the same thing myself on occasion. But they hardly ever come up with arguments that are as sort of wildly uncogent as that argument. I mean, the argument is it's possible that this happened, therefore it did happen. Imagine if I come home and tell my wife that President Obama has decided there is to be a new medal for philosophy struck, and I'm to be the first recipient. Well, she says, what makes you think that? And I say, nobody's proved it impossible. Not a good argument, right? As far as I can see, that's the only argument there is in that book for the conclusion that all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes, or that the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design.